Foundation is information and research. Foundation is information research. Reforming the early learning, care and school-age childcare system in Ireland. Recent policy development, early implementation. Meeting on Monday, 14th of March, 2022. Partnership for the Public Good. A new funding model for early learning and care and school-age childcare, with Professor Eva Lloyd from the University of East London and Hazel O'Byrne from the Department of Children, Equality, Disability, Integration and Youth in Ireland. Professor Eva Lloyd, OBE, is Professor of Early Childhood and Director of the International Centre for the Study of the Mixed Economy of Childcare at the University of East London. She's Visiting Professor at University College London, attached to the Thomas Coram Foundation. For over 35 years, she's been researching the role played by early childhood education and care systems in the lives of young children and their families, particularly for children growing up in poverty. Eva has extensive experience in providing advice to and co-authoring official evaluations and reports to national and local government, most recently during her work on a new funding model for early childhood education and care systems in Ireland, which is explored in this film.
You know, when we do comparisons, you tend to compare to your own country, to England, maybe the United States here, Norway, and Ireland. So a few things, a few figures here then. Population of just over 5 million, so really that's much smaller than in England. And for the number of children, I could only find the April 2016 census figure, but I gather that there hasn't been a major population increase, so that's probably still roughly the number of children there. The school starting age 6, because most children start a bit early at 4 or 5 in what are known as national schools. I am very reassured that I have 3 colleagues from Ireland here who know everything and can correct anything I'm telling you if it's wrong, you know. But then I want to, in my next few points there on that slide, I want to turn straight away to children in low income households or children with experiencing other forms of disadvantage. So there are 26% of children under 16 were experiencing poverty in 2019. Those are the latest figures, not quite as high a percentage as we have here in England, but still quite high. Consistent poverty rate, there are various poverty rates, but the consistent one is the highest in single parent families, mostly of course, headed by women, mothers, and the percentage of children between the ages of 0 and 17 most at risk of consistent poverty in 2019 was 8%. So that gives you some sort of insight, hopefully, to prepare you for what we'll be saying about the aims that the expert group had for the provision to reach all children. Now I'm trying to move on my screen, but I'm not doing too well here. So I don't know why I'm not doing too well. You see, I knew I would need technical advice. Right. Suddenly it's there. A quick picture here of the balance between the population living in rural areas, including very rural areas, and in urban areas. It's not quite 50-50. The majority live in urban areas, the majority of the population, but it's probably less than you would have thought. You know, maybe you think, I don't know, you might have thought of Ireland as very much dominated by rural areas, but it isn't. When the expert group started its work, it started from the baseline of the existing early childhood system. So there was an early childhood care and education program that started as far back as 2010, although there have been a few, but in principle 15 hours weekly provision during term time, and that is for 2 years before children starting school, although as we already saw, some children will start school at 4 or 5, and they can start at age 3. And that provision is funded direct by government. And then we have school-age childcare, which has been regulated by 2019. Now, obviously, the Irish system has a history that goes back further than what I'm looking at here, but there's too much detail there to go into, and I wouldn't be the best person to go into it in any depth. So one of the latest innovations in that system was the National Childcare Scheme, which was established in 2019. So it had really just started running when the expert group started its work looking at a new funding model for these different services. This is a subsidy model, and one of the most interesting things about it, if you're looking at it from an English perspective, is that there is a general universal subsidy for children the first 3 years, basically from the end of maternity leave until they start this EdSheet program at 3, which is 20 hours if there is one parent not working or studying, and it can be up to 45 hours of a subsidy for employed parents. And that goes up to 15 years and covers both early care and learning and school-age childcare. And they're using the Irish terms here. Across this, the access and inclusion model applies, a model that started in schools, and it is aimed at helping children with special educational needs and other types of additional needs, such as not having English or Irish as a first language. Something quick about the National Action Plan for Childminding, which runs from last year until 2028, because this is a big area of proportion, which is quite different from what we have in England, because so far it's really been outside any regulations. So it's been outside a formal system. And there are about 15,000 childminders in Ireland, but there are conditions attached to registering with the inspectorate, and that is if they care for more than 3 preschool children, preschool age children, or more than 6 mixed age children altogether. And actually, at the moment, there's still a very low number of childminders registered, but the action plan hopes to, over time, make a difference to that and introduce much more training and support, including childminding support groups, hubs, and so on. One of the things that our group was allowed to look at was where there are recommendations that in principle would apply to group-based provision might also be suitable for childminding. And we come out with that conclusion that certainly that should work for childminders. Registered childminders can receive the subsidy for EdSheet. Finally, I think you would all agree that it's important to note that progressive universalism, which we all know so well from Michael Marmot, underpins the funding stream that on the existing system and the system that is the new system. Really, with more money, the fewer money is in the family, the higher the level of subsidy. So a few figures, what are we talking about? Some 200,000 children under 15 were using these services, these early learning and care and school-age childcare services in 1819, 4,700 settings. There is a dot there when there should be a comma, but providing those services, 30,000 staff employed in these settings. And then you see that only 32% offer full daycare. So that's quite a difference compared to the English situation, So in terms of development, if Ireland wants more full-time care. That's a challenging road to go, but they have embarked on it. But you can see that within the system as a whole, there'll be changes to be made if more providers want to deliver full-time care, with all the challenges that involves for space, for qualified staff, and so on. Again, you'll see that the division between urban and rural areas in terms of availability of provision is fairly equal. And then there are also 256 Irish language services. I have been working on the pronunciation of this in Irish today, but I don't trust myself, so I'll wait for Hazel and Toby to say that properly when it's their turn to speak. But that's very important too, of course. There are some, apart from the differences I've already touched on, there are other key differences between Ireland and England. First of all, Ireland has had a Department for Children for much longer than we have, I'd like to say, but I can't say that because we don't have a Department for Children in England. But since 2011, Department of Children and Youth Affairs was a separate department. Before that, children were in other departments, the department that Anne-Marie Brooks was talking about just now before we started officially. The department where the chair of the expert group was General Secretary Michael Scanlon, and so on. The other striking difference was for me, for instance, when I joined the group and learned about the system, was that there is no local government role in respect of early childhood provision. So that's very unlike that's really unlike the rest of Europe, not just the rest of England. There is local government with a very limited brief if you compare it to local government roles in other European countries. The other striking thing is that there is no public provision, and there hasn't been, of early childhood education and care. 74% is private. That it means private for profit, although most are sole traders and small providers. And then community providers is 26%. So again, that is very unlike the rest of Europe. We can think, nursery classes in primary schools and nursery education in Scotland and England, and goes back to the 19th century. So that's quite interesting. The way in which these services are registered, inspected, supported is divided up between three agencies: TUSLA, POBL, and the Department of Education. But that way of executing these functions was under review more or less from the point where we started our work. So I shall be interested to hear from my Irish colleagues where we are now. Is that a review of the operational way of? So that's quite complex. That for instance, that the Department of Education has an inspection role for the early education provision and is responsible for curriculum development, whereas TUSLA has an inspection role. It's something to get your mind around, but I'm used to complex systems. Early childhood education and care systems are often very complex. So it doesn't entirely surprise me because of the organic way in which they have evolved. So the next step is then to look at the more recent history of early childhood policy in Ireland, and in particular, the launch of the First Five program, a whole of government strategy for young children and their families, which was in 2018 and was a very important step in the evolution of the early childhood education and care system. It was preceded by several years of very hard work in which several of my colleagues on the expert group were very much involved and played leading roles. And the interdepartmental working group, which came out with a report in 2015, were the future investment in childcare in Ireland. And really, from that point onwards, it was very high on the agenda. And the very important point from our group's point of view that came out of that launch of First Five was really that there were key funding commitments to at least double the investment by 2028. So that was in that period. Now, I can give you an advanced peep on what we said in our report, but what was that actually we do think that the amount that was envisaged, the amount of 970,000 million euro, would probably not quite cover the recommendation. That's where we have recommended that actually. But that's for my colleagues to comment on, of course. And then in September 2019, the then Minister for Children announced the formation of this expert group to develop a new funding model for this system, which would now be getting much more funding than it had before in the preceding 20 years. And then in 2020, of course, COVID started. It's something else we were talking about briefly before we started the meeting, which is that there was a huge amount of support from the government for the early childhood sector. From the beginning of COVID, huge amount of financial and practical support. Although all provision was closed during the first lockdown, unlike provision in England, for instance, which stayed open for key workers and so on, the support is only now beginning to be tapered. So that's very different from what we've experienced here in the early childhood sector. Just to keep us awake, quick picture of the group. There are some important people missing, which is that Hazel O'Byrne was on maternity leave when this picture was taken at the launch, and so she's not in the picture. When I look at it, I see a good gender balance, 50-50, including the missing man, Philip, who was part of the group. And we also have 5 senior civil servants there and 5 non-civil servants, of which 3 are the international group, Professor Mellowish, Tove Moxach-Slinden, who is here today and attending the meeting. So it's lovely to have her here today, and me. So I won't show you the final picture of the group taken when we presented our report to the minister, because that's, of course, is one of those pictures of the gallery in a Zoom meeting, you know, that's where we were when we finished last December. The expert group to develop a new funding model had extensive terms of reference, but I've just summarized for you the key points. And they are that guiding principles would be very important for us to develop. We consulted on the guiding principles in the first phase of an extensive consultation process with the sector and with absolutely all the stakeholders. And then we were to review the funding approach in terms of alignment with guiding principles and effectiveness in delivering on policy objectives. And that policy objectives were quality, affordability, and contributing to addressing disadvantage. They weren't expected to sort that completely. And we were expected to draw on international evidence in determining how additional funding for the system could be structured and used. And the final report supposed to contain a design for a new funding model with costings, risk analysis, and mitigation, and a phased implementation plan. So it was quite a tall order, I thought. But of course, my colleagues were all very keen to do this. It's very important to remember, though, the boundaries of those terms of reference, because we were not asked to propose changes to the current model of delivery, which was private provision. It is a childcare market with not-for-profit and for-profit providers, mostly small ones. But we should explore how the policy objectives could be achieved in a privately operated market through increased public funding and public management. It was clearly foreseen that there would be a strengthened role for the government in the new system. a very full slide. I know that's bad practice, but I'll talk you through it very quickly. I have put it up there, that 2-year timeline for our work, because various upheavals happened during that timeline. Of course, one was, of course, a general election in February 2020, which meant that the minister lost her seat and we got a new minister. And also, and as you will have read about the Irish election, there's quite a restructure of really the balance between different parties and so on. And then COVID, a month later, so we started meeting online. And then a new government in June. And in October 2020, a program for government, Our Shared Future, which had 14 commitments on ELC and SAC. And one included ensuring sustainability of the ELC and SAC sector by fast tracking the work of the expert group considering a new funding model. So no pressure there then, fast tracking. What exactly was envisaged? Well, we worked to our original timeline, but what happened was that in the October budget of the new government, measures were published that reflected our emerging recommendations, and that was actually very satisfying. It did mean we had to agree on some of the key issues like core funding for providers. And then at the end of the year, November, December, there was the final meeting of the group, and the 25 recommendations in the report submitted to the minister and subsequently accepted by the Irish cabinet and the Irish government. And my colleagues, of course, are dealing with the aftermath of this, of implementing these recommendations. As part of our work, as I said, we were supposed to draw on international knowledge. And we worked with Frontier Economics, that many of you will be familiar with, who also have an office in Ireland. And we asked them we agreed together the number of areas where they would do research, and they chose countries that were particularly interesting to the Irish model because they operate mixed market economies of early childhood education and care, and that included the Netherlands, and Ireland, and Norway, Bavaria, and Germany, and a few more, because it appeared more interesting to look at systems that were vaguely similar and how they addressed the issues that were important for us to look at than to look at systems that were completely different. And this is the list of publications. You can, if you were interested in any of them, they're all online. And these the list of topics that they researched in the order in which they researched them. And those reports came on stream as we were working on these topics and informed our work. For instance, there is a very interesting report on mechanisms to control fees, parental fees, approaches to identifying children or settings in need, funding models that particularly address early childhood disadvantage. So it may be relevant to some of the work that you're doing. There was a very extensive stakeholder consultation process that ran alongside the group's work and that of the workforce development group that you will hear about from Toby Wolfe. It was a public consultation that included every possible method of talking to stakeholders. More traditional classical call for submissions, and online consultation events had to be online with practitioners, with managers, with parents, a national survey of households talking about early childhood education and care and parents' use and so on. And then in phase 2 and 3 of the consultation, there was more a particular stakeholder group that was working with the department there, who were consultant on plans, ideas, their own proposals for increasing parental affordability, addressing disadvantage, and improving the partnership between providers and parents and the state. I want to end my little presentation on context with a small section from the foreword to the report Partnership for the Public Good from our chair, Michael Scanlon. And he says then that the expert group believes that the conclusions and recommendations in this report achieve a good balance between ambition and pragmatism. It is, if implemented in the manner envisaged by the expert group, the recommendations can transform the ELC and SAC sector by supporting quality-driven pay and conditions for practitioners, implementation of the workforce development plan, greater financial stability for providers, improved affordability for parents, and new resources to promote and provide more socially inclusive services. This is part of the second paragraph. And I just want to draw your attention to the fact that we put, and that Michael Scanlon deliberately put, a view that was really strong within the expert group, that you start with the workforce. That is the most urgent area for improvement. In many policy papers, of course, parents and children are put first, but in terms of this these funding proposals, we put the workforce first. So I'm very happy now to hand back to the chair and hand over to my Irish colleague Hazel O'Byrne. And so thank you.
Thank you very much. So shall we, as Eva says, go straight over to Hazel?
Okay, now just let me do this tricky bit of trying to share the screen. So thank you. So Eva mentioned the guiding principles, and as that is the first of the group's terms of reference. So that was a kind of a very important foundational piece of their work. And I wanted just to share them, albeit in kind of abbreviated format here, because I think it really does give a good sense of the direction that the group established for themselves, and indeed, as Eva said, with kind of informed by input from various stakeholders. So the first of those guiding principles was that the new funding model should be strategic, designed to support the public good, and particularly focused on child well-being and development, as well as supporting kind of parental engagement in employment and the impact that has on the economy and wider society. In terms of the strategic nature of the funding model, that quality, affordability, accessibility, and sustainability were all important elements, and that the new funding model should be designed to address the deficiencies of the existing system through greater public management. And Eva was clear on that kind of element of the group's terms of reference, that it was to work within the existing model, and to the group also kind of made a strong point of aligning well with other strategic developments, and Eva has mentioned some of them. Second of the guiding principles was that the new funding model should be child-centred, in the best interests of children, promote partnerships with parents, and provide additional support for children who need it. That the funding model should be family oriented, and, as I said, supporting parental employment, education and training, and cognizant of the reasonable needs and choices of parents, although acknowledging that they can be vary very significantly from family to family, and different kinds of circumstances that families have. Progressive universalism is a kind of key underpinning theme of the work, that there would be universal benefits for all children, but more support for families with greater needs, and that the new funding model should seek to mitigate costs to families, which in an Irish context are acknowledged to be relatively high. That another kind of key part of the guiding principles was that the new funding model should be focused on developing a professional and valued workforce, and acknowledging very clearly that the quality of services is dependent on the quality of the workforce. So recruitment and retention are really important, that ongoing training and development are important, and Toby, I'm sure, will speak to these issues in more detail later, and that fair pay and working conditions are a key kind of factor in all of that, because at the moment we know working conditions, pay and working conditions are poorer than we think they should be, and that impacts on quality. So the new funding model should seek to address that and support the development of the workforce, so that they are valued and more motivated. The new funding model should be designed to support this concept of a competent sector. So that's based on continuous improvement, enabling long-term developments, reflecting the reasonable costs to providers and subject to robust regulation and accountability. And that the new funding model should kind of be implementable, should be based on input from stakeholders, be based on evidence, and based on data collection, and have measurable outcomes. So all of those, and there's an awful lot there, all of those were kind of very much part of the expert group's thinking in their analysis of the current system and their design of the recommendations that I'll speak to now in a second. So I'm essentially going to summarize kind of some of the kind of key points from the report itself. So, you know, the first thing I think that's important, and I hope kind of builds on the context that Eva has provided in framing, I guess, their report kind of it provided kind of detailed analysis of the existing system. And Eva talked about the important commitment that there was in First Five about at least doubling the funding in the sector over a 10-year period from the publication of First Five. So in kind of thinking about that commitment, the expert group looked at, you know, how Ireland compared in an international context in terms of the level of funding in the sector. And one of the frontier economics papers kind of focused on this quite specifically. So I suppose the one of the key kind of messages from that was just about the challenges of international comparisons and the kind of the exact parameters and nature of what is counted and what is not counted vary kind of significantly. So they were noted very clearly. But notwithstanding that, there was a sense that the first, as Eva said, the First Five commitment was welcome to double funding to at least 970 million by 2028. While that commitment was welcomed, I think there was a big focus on the at least element of that commitment, that the expert group certainly felt that, yes, we needed to increase and at least double the funding, and probably quite a bit more than that in order to fulfill the full vision of what the expert group envisaged. So the group talked about some of the positive features of the current system. So that universal early childhood care and education program, the free preschool year, or the 2 free preschool years, and both the targeted and universal elements of the national childcare subsidies that Eva has described. But there were also a number of important kind of concerns and issues that informed their thinking. So one was the high level of employee turnover, driven primarily by low pay and poor conditions, and particularly the extent to which this impacts on quality, and particularly because we know about the importance of consistency, for the consistency of relationships for young children. So high turnover is particularly detrimental to that. They also noted the sense of precariousness that's felt by many providers, and that it doesn't make for a robust kind of system, and that's something that needs to be addressed. The high fee burden on some parents, and I'll come on to that in a bit more detail, and the absence of any specific supports to tackle disadvantage, I suppose, were key kind of issues that they identified as needing to be addressed in the new funding model. So in framing then the reform of the funding model, the expert group talked about the importance of the funding model being very closely aligned with the public good and benefits for children and parents. That should be its focus. That currently the Irish system is shaped by the market on the one hand and the structure of public funding on the other hand, and those two things kind of interact to determine largely kind of the type of provision that we have. That there's a need for greater state investment, as we've said, but to go alongside that and hand in hand with it, greater public management of the system as a whole. And their kind of major recommendation, and I'll talk about this in a bit more detail shortly, but their major recommendation is that supply side funding was a key mechanism to achieve that greater level of public management. So the other major types of funding that we've talked about, the free preschool program and the national childcare scheme, are kind of hybrid models, but kind of maybe more focused on the demand side, or subsidizing, I guess, parents' costs, but supply side funding as being a key to kind of unlocking some of the issues in the system was a major kind of reflection of the expert group and informed their recommendations. So the key themes then that they looked at, so quality, and I've made this point that the currently paying conditions are the biggest issue undermining quality, that the state should support agreement on improved paying conditions through the JLC, through that supply side funding. And sorry, I should have spelled out the acronyms, but the JLC is the Joint Labour Committee. So that's an industrial relations mechanism to allow for the agreement of pay rates between employer and employee representatives. So there's a Joint Labour Committee which was fairly recently established for the sector, and that is currently seeking to negotiate pay rates for the sector. And it was the strong view of the expert group that the supply side funding should be made available to support that group in determining new rates of pay. So in addition then to the improvements in pay, the expert group were clear that supply side funding should also enable other features of service quality, things like non-contact time, like continuous professional development, support for curriculum implementation and collaboration across early learning and care services and between early learning and care services and other services within the community. So there's a quote there from the expert group's report: the funding model should aim to develop and support a partnership between the state and providers, with both being jointly responsible for the delivery of quality services. So very much seeing this as a partnership endeavour. And indeed, that's reflected in the title of the report, Partnership for the Public Good. So the next theme that the group looked at was about affordability and fee controls. So their analysis showed that out-of-pocket costs for families were high for many families, and that was particularly the case for families with multiple children and using a lot of hours of early learning and care and school age childcare. They remarked on the very significant variation in fees charged within local authority areas and across the country. And they were of the view that there was a very strong rationale for initiating a fee management system at this point, at the point of introducing a new supply side funding. And their view is that a more structured approach to managing parental fees charged by providers is required. So currently, outside of the ECHE programme, which is free to parents, so fees are capped in that instance, but outside of that, there is currently no fee management policy. On addressing disadvantage, the group noted that poverty and socioeconomic disadvantage significantly impact on young children, and that while disadvantage is widely dispersed in Ireland, its impact is compounded where that disadvantage is concentrated. It pointed to what's called the access and inclusion model that Eva mentioned, which exists for children with disabilities, that provides helpful direction for universal supports. So AIM is a tiered model of supports, and that there's significant learning in that for informing our approach to addressing disadvantage. But also what's called the DESH model in the primary and secondary education system, and that's delivering equality in schools. And that's what DESH stands for. So that is a useful model for us to build on in early learning and care and school age childcare for developing targeted supports for where there is concentrated disadvantage. And the expert group said, we favour the development and implementation of strong universal supports to address the needs of children experiencing disadvantage, and an additional supply side budget stream to support enhanced service provision. So on the theme then of public management partnership and the role of the state, that they again were very explicit that public funding should be oriented to achieve policy objectives, and very directly kind of drawing that line, but noting that requires proactive, supportive public management at local and national level, that it can't be just about the money going in. There needs to be kind of people and infrastructure there to enable that to work well. And that there's a need for a partnership approach to achieve this between providers and the state, and that should be underpinned by openness and transparency and mutual trust between the state and providers. And noting that the state has a right and a duty to ensure that the market serves the public good. And that's very much this partnership for the public good idea again. So based on all of that analysis, they developed what we're referring to as the new funding model. So that's that kind of circle with the 4 quadrants there. So 2 of those elements, the National Childcare Scheme and the Early Childhood Care and Education Programme, are already in place, although with some developments to each of them. But core funding and tackling disadvantaged funding were the new kind of new elements of the funding model. So core funding as a new supply side payment designed to support quality, including improved pay, sustainability and enhanced public management, with conditions on fee control and cost transparency, incorporating funding for administration and support for the employment of graduate staff. So that's the major kind of piece that's we're in detailed implementation of now. Tackling disadvantaged funding is to come a bit later, so that we don't have available budget for that in this budget year, but hopefully that will come on course shortly, and that is intended to be new universal and targeted approaches to addressing socioeconomic disadvantage with accompanying funding streams. So that's to build on top of the other 3 elements in due course. So that's the kind of the translation of that new funding model kind of into practice is evident in the expert group's recommendations. So I'll briefly just speak to them. So on core funding, as I said, their recommendation here was that core funding would be a supply side payment to support quality services and enable this cultural shift towards partnership. That core funding should be calculated based on capacity. So that's the places that a service would offer and the hours and weeks for which they'd be offered, and the age group of children for which they'd be offered. And it would be based on what services we're committing to offer rather than actual participation or attendance, which is the basis for funding our other funding schemes. That core funding should enable the Joint Labour Committee to agree an employment regulation order to set new rates of pay, and the implementation of the workforce plan that Toby will speak to now. That core funding should incorporate funding for administrative supports and supports for employing graduates. So there was previously funding schemes for administration and support for employing graduates in one part of the system, but that core funding should incorporate those to work for the system as a whole. It should unlock access to other supports and resources, for example, access to capital funding. So that being in contract for core funding would be a prerequisite to access capital, and that the conditions for core funding should include fee management, quality improvement measures, implementation of practice frameworks, transparent financial reporting and other data collection, and offering the National Childcare Scheme and the Early Childhood Care and Education Programme. Tackling disadvantage, look, I think we've covered that, and as I said, that's a kind of later development to come. So that's about universal and targeted supports. Fee management is to start this year initially with a fee freeze, and with further developments to come in future years. So more sophisticated fee management system once more detailed information on the current kind of income and costs of services is available. And affordability measures are developments really to the National Childcare Scheme, so an extension of the universal subsidy and a revised approach to calculating NCS for families with more than one child to reduce the withdrawal rate. And then the role of the state is about ensuring that there's the necessary infrastructure and resources there to support this enhanced public management function. And also importantly, Eva talked about the terms of reference in terms of operating within the existing model of delivery, but the expert group did also recommend that in the medium term that government examine whether some element of public provision should be introduced alongside private provision. So that's a whistle-stop tour of the recommendations. And just to summarise, the expert group's vision for the sector is one that's increasingly publicly funded and publicly managed, delivering a service for the public good through a partnership between the state and providers to the benefit of children, parents, practitioners and society overall. So look, that there's a bit there on implementation that I maybe won't focus on, and well, just to acknowledge the enormous work of the expert group, and particularly the members that are on the call here, and international members Eva and Tova, and the huge amount of contributions from various people that fed into that group. So I'll stop sharing there if that's okay.
That's lovely. Thank you very much. Because it's an extremely complex set of data that you presented. Toby, would you like to take over now?
Nurturing skills, a new workforce plan for early learning and care and school-age childcare. Introduced by Toby Wolfe from the Department of Children, Equality, Disability, Integration and Youth in Ireland.
Work alongside Hazel and Anne-Marie in the Department of Children. I head what's called the Quality Unit, which has responsibility for the workforce in early years, early learning care and school-age childcare, but also the regulation of services, the inspection system, and so on, as well as, I suppose, more broadly, supports for quality improvement in the sector. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the workforce plan, nurturing skills. Now, I'm going to talk about the development of what we're calling nurturing skills. It's a workforce plan for those working in early years services, early learning care services, and school-age childcare services over the next 6-7 years. And it was developed in parallel with the work on partnership with the public good that Eva and Hazel were talking about. It started at the same time. It was very much a parallel project. We did the consultation sort of hand in hand. The two went together, and it was launched at the same time. And so that was a very, very deliberate, because as both Eva and Hazel were saying, we see the workforce as really critical to the delivery of, well, really of everything in the sector, but in particular, it's critical, I suppose, the quality of our training for the workforce, the skills they have, the qualifications they have are critical for the quality of provision. And we know how important quality is for delivering positive outcomes for children. So just the challenges that we were set in developing the workforce plan, they stemmed from First Five, our 10-year strategy that Eva spoke about. And the commitments there that we have really then fleshed out in our nurturing skills are commitments to move to a graduate-led workforce in early learning and care by 2028, to raise the profile of careers in the sector, to support recruitment and retention in the sector, with a clear career framework and leadership development opportunities, to develop a national program of CPD for those working in the sector, to work towards a more gender balanced and diverse workforce, and to introduce minimum qualifications for the first time in school-age childcare and in childminding. We already have minimum qualifications in early learning and care for those working in centre-based settings. So those were the challenges that were set. And the process, as I say, it ran in parallel to the process of partnership with the public good. There was an interagency steering group that included external experts as well as civil servants. There was a stakeholder group that ran in parallel to the whole way through and met in between meetings of the steering group. And a number of working groups during the second phase of work with a very high degree of stakeholder involvement in the development of the strategy and the drafting of material and so on. In addition to a public consultation process with a survey, focus groups and so on, very much mirroring at the same time as the consultation on partnership with the public good. And the work on workforce plan benefited from a participation in parallel in two international projects that were also looking at workforce issues in the early years. One is the EU working group on early childhood education and care that resulted in a European Commission report at the end of 2020 on professionalization of the early years workforce. So we were participants in that process, but also in the OECD Quality Beyond Regulations process that resulted in the Starting Strong 6 report last year. And because of the focus the OECD was taking on these issues around improving quality and particularly the interactions between adults and children through workforce development, we chose we asked the OECD to carry out a country policy review of Ireland, a much more in-depth review of Ireland than many other OECD countries were the level of participation they had in this Quality Beyond Regulations project. So that was published at the same time, and both those EU and OECD reports very much influenced the conclusions of our work. So I'll perhaps just race through this, but I'll focus on this slide that I think tries to capture in one visual the different elements of the workforce plan, nurturing skills. So we have identified 5 different pillars. All the actions within the plan, there are over 50 or so actions, are all in one of these 5 pillars. The first pillar is actions to establish a career framework, clearly setting out qualification requirements, for example, for those different career grades within the workforce. The second pillar focuses on actions to raise qualification levels within the sector, to upskill the sector, if you like, both those working early years educators, those working in with the young age group, those working with school-age children, and childminders. The third pillar is a number of actions aiming to develop and really create a clear national system of continuing professional development. The fourth pillar is a number of actions aiming to support recruitment and retention in the workforce, and also to strengthen diversity in the workforce. And the fifth pillar is a number of actions around moving incrementally towards regulation of the profession. It's not, while the services are regulated, and we do have minimum qualification requirements, as a profession, it's not a regulated profession yet, but that's the direction we're going. But there's a clear recognition in nurturing skills that our success in all of these actions depends on a number of enablers, we call them, key enablers, some of which are really outside the scope of direct intervention through the action plan. So the first enabler is improvement in pay and conditions of employment. And this is where the work on the workforce plan very much links to the work that Hazel was talking about on with the new core funding stream that arose out of partnership with the public good. That we're only going to be able to really upskill the workforce, keep people who are well qualified, encourage them to come in, and then keep them in the workforce if we can achieve improvement in their pay and conditions. And in a sector where services are privately owned, privately managed, the state isn't the direct employer. We have no direct lever to control pay and conditions. But what we have put in place, we've, I suppose, kick-started this, what's called this joint labor committee, as Hazel described it, this industrial relations mechanism between employers and employees and union reps. And the core funding stream provides financial backing for whatever may hopefully come out of that shortly. So that process, I suppose we're doing what we can to push it along. It's a key enabler for success of nurturing skills. And a second key enabler that's somewhat outside the direct scope of this is the strengthening of our infrastructure of quality supports for the sector. And that's another parallel project that we could have another presentation on if we had time, which is about our review of our operating model, as we call it, the services, the supports for quality improvement in the sector. And then the third key enabler is ongoing engagement with the profession, really a commitment to build on the high level of stakeholder involvement that ran through the development of this project and keep that going through its implementation. So there's a monitoring committee being established to oversee and monitor implementation over the 7 years. The plan itself has an implementation plan lasting the first 3 years. There'll then be a midpoint review in 2025 and possibly adjustment at that point, with an second implementation plan then for the final 3 years. I'll just fly through. I've got a slide on each of the different pillars, but I'll not go into this detail. Happy to come back to it. But just to say, I'll just say perhaps one key sort of headline on each of the 5 pillars. On the first pillar, establishing a career framework, we're setting out a clear sort of a structure of roles in settings and a clear identification of qualifications, either expected or required of those different roles. And a commitment to have 50% of, we at the moment have 34% of the sector have a degree, a relevant degree. We aim to achieve 50% or more, including everybody in what we're calling a lead educator role. That means somebody who is leading the practice with each group of children to have a degree by 2028. At the moment, if you're a manager of a setting, there's no qualification requirement. We are aiming to introduce minimum qualifications for those in managerial roles, and also to introduce a minimum qualification for the first time for those in working in school-age childcare. I can come back to that. This is, I suppose, our visual describing, setting out the different roles in the sector and the supports we're going to put in place to support educators on their career ladder, progressing through the different the career framework that we've set out. The second pillar is actions to support the raising of qualification levels, and the key action here that we're busily working on at the moment is developing a new financial support for those who are working in the sector to undertake higher education qualifications in early learning and care, including particularly degree level qualifications. So there's funding that will be available for people while they're working in the sector to undertake degrees with most of the cost met by the state as they work through the degrees. And we're busily, I suppose, putting the finishing touches to plans at the moment that will be released in the coming weeks on that. And in parallel with that, we will also be providing funding for services who release staff to go on student practice placements or study leave, to make it as easy as possible for people who are working in the sector to upskill while continuing to work in the sector. The third pillar around the CPD system. CPD is delivered through a range of providers, but what we are hoping to do is to increasingly channel that through channel educators to access that range of CPD that's available through a single national gateway, where anything that is in that gateway is quality assured. So we're developing strengthening our quality assurance processes for CPD over the years ahead, and making it easier for people to find and then sort of track their own participation in CPD as they undertake it. The fourth pillar around recruitment, retention, and diversity of the workforce. Well, here, I mean, I think really our key action here is that key enabler around trying to strengthen wages and working conditions in the sector. We're very clear it's only if wages rise that we are really going to address the challenge of recruitment and retention. And it is a challenge, as I think it's a challenge in many countries in this sector. But complementing those efforts, we have a number of actions in the workforce plan to strengthen information, to strengthen about career and training opportunities, to actively promote careers in the sector, encouraging people to come and work in the sector, but also supporting diversity, training in diversity, equality, and inclusion, and examining the development of a range of alternative entry routes in the sector, including work-based learning, such as apprenticeship routes into the sector over the coming years. And the fifth pillar, as I said, it's about moving towards regulation of the profession. We already have, I suppose, some of the elements of regulation of the profession in place through the regulation of services and through a process we've been undertaking over the last few years to strengthen and bring more consistency to the standards that apply across the different further and higher education awards in early learning and care. So we have greater confidence that anybody doing a qualification is doing a qualification that meets certain standards. But we are planning to continue this process of professionalization and move towards regulation of the profession. So I think I've said a bit about the different key enablers already. So then just to say, in terms of implementation, we are moving ahead with that quickly. And but one of the things we also want to put in place in terms of monitoring is we are joining the OECD TALIS Starting Strong survey for the first time for the next round of that, which is in 2024. It's based on a survey of educators. So hopefully that'll give us some more data to help us with monitoring of nurturing skills and that midpoint review. So I will stop there.
Toby, thank you very much indeed.